August 1944. A midnight storm rolls across northern France. Thunder flashes over endless convoys. Trucks crawling through the blackness like veins of light across the war-torn countryside. Their engines growl against mud and rain, the smell of diesel thick in the air. Each headlamp is half covered, dimmed to a slit, guiding the way past burned villages and cratered roads. Inside one truck, a young driver grips the wheel with blistered hands. His name won't appear in history books, but his cargo, drums of fuel and ammunition, will keep an entire army moving toward Germany. Behind him, hundreds more follow in a line that never ends. They call it the Red Ball Express, the lifeline of the Allied advance after D-Day. More than 6,000 trucks running day and night, feeding the war machine across liberated France. Yet the vehicle that made it all possible was once dismissed as useless, a worthless blueprint buried in a pile of forgotten army designs. No one could have known that this forgotten truck would become the beating heart of victory. The rain-soaked convoy fades into the dawn, and the story rewinds to where it all began. Before the thunder of tanks and the roar of convoys, there was silence, the silence of indecision. In 1939, the United States Army was still preparing for a war it had not yet entered. Its soldiers drilled with wooden rifles, its aircraft were outdated, and its transport fleet looked more like a farmer's collection of tractors than a modern army's backbone. The world was already burning. Poland had fallen. France was preparing for invasion. Yet across the Atlantic, America's war planners faced a quieter crisis. Mobility. The U.S. Army had learned bitter lessons from the First World War. Supplies had been hauled by mules, wagons, and scattered truck models from a dozen manufacturers. It was chaos. Spare parts didn't fit, engines overheated, and the front lines were constantly starved of fuel and ammunition. By 1938, the War Department vowed to end that. The next war, they said, would be a mechanized war, fast, relentless, fought by machines that never slept. But that dream needed one thing above all: a truck that could survive anything. The first designs came from a wave of hopeful manufacturers: Studebaker, Ford, and General Motors. Each promised a vehicle that could haul 2.5 tons across any terrain. Most failed. Too heavy, too fragile, too expensive. Among them was a quiet submission from a small group of engineers at General Motors. A simple, boxy design they labeled GMC CCKW. The military brass wasn't impressed. The CCKW looked ordinary. No armor, no heavy gun, just a utilitarian frame and a 6-cylinder engine. One Army evaluator dismissed it outright. A truck like this wouldn't last a week in combat. The blueprint was shelved. The War Department wanted something modern, not a workhorse built from civilian parts. But that rejection would prove short-sighted. As the 1940s dawned and Europe fell deeper into war, the U.S. began to rethink everything. The French collapse in 1940 shocked Washington. Germany's speed had been powered by logistics. The Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg didn't just rely on tanks. It relied on the vehicles that carried their fuel and ammunition. America's generals saw the writing on the wall. If the United States entered the war, it would need to move faster than the enemy. And for that, it needed trucks that could do the impossible. Suddenly, those worthless blueprints were pulled from the archives. The GMC engineers were called back. Their design, once discarded, had a new mission. The Army needed tens of thousands of trucks. Cheap, standardized, easy to repair. The engineers reworked the CCKW into a production-ready version with one focus: reliability. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. The 1 to 2 ton truck, soon nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, began rolling off assembly lines in 1941. Each one could carry soldiers, ammunition, or fuel drums. It could cross mud, sand, and snow. Its parts were interchangeable. Its engine was simple enough to repair with a wrench and a hammer. By the time the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the CCKW was ready. Factories across America shifted into overdrive. Convoys of these trucks rolled out of plants in Michigan, Missouri, and Illinois, each stamped with serial numbers that would one day stretch from North Africa to Normandy. Still, no one imagined that this plain, steel-bodied truck, born from a rejected design, would one day hold the fate of an army. Because as the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944, the war's next great battle wasn't about tanks or guns, it was about supply. The front lines were moving faster than ever before. Patton's Third Army raced east across France, devouring fuel faster than any plan had predicted. Rail lines were destroyed, ports were clogged, and bridges lay in ruins. The Allied advance was at risk of grinding to a halt, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks. And when that crisis came, the Army turned to the truck once labeled worthless. The CCKW would now face its trial by fire and the birth of the greatest logistical operation of the Western Front. June 1944, Normandy. The beaches had been won, but the real test had just begun. In the first weeks after D-Day, the Allies pushed inland through hedgerows, rain, and relentless German resistance. Town by town, they clawed their way across northern France. But victory came with a problem no one had predicted in full. Success was moving too fast. Within 30 days of landing, Allied forces had advanced nearly 100 miles from the beaches. Their tanks and vehicles devoured supplies at a rate that shattered every calculation made in London and Washington. Ammunition, rations, and above all, fuel were running out. Each Sherman tank drank nearly 2 gallons of gasoline for every mile it advanced. The trucks and jeeps that followed them demanded thousands more. The port of Cherbourg had only just been captured, and it was wrecked beyond use. The next major harbor, Antwerp, was still in German hands. The railways were useless. Bombed bridges, twisted rails, and German demolition teams had turned France's transport system into rubble. The Allied war machine was stuck, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower knew what that meant. If the advance stalled, the enemy would regroup, dig in, and turn the summer of victory into another winter of stalemate. Something had to be done. Fast. In late July 1944, at a military logistics meeting in Normandy, a radical plan was proposed. A non-stop truck convoy system. Dedicated routes. Round-the-clock drivers. No stops except for loading and refueling. The plan's name came from U.S. railroad terminology. Red Ball. The code for express freight lines carrying vital cargo at maximum priority. The system would run from the temporary ports and supply depots near Normandy all the way to the advancing armies. A supply artery, pulsing across hundreds of miles of war-torn France. Every road on that route would be marked with red circles, every vehicle bearing the same symbol on its hood. The Red Ball Express was born, but it needed trucks, thousands of them, and fast. Once again, the Army turned to the one machine that could take the punishment, the GMC CCKW W2 1 to 2 ton truck. Within weeks, more than 6,000 trucks were mobilized. Mechanics stripped, repaired, and refitted every vehicle they could find. The convoys began rolling on August 25, 1944, just as Paris was liberated. The scale was unprecedented. Each day, the Red Ball Express carried more than 12,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food, enough to sustain the entire Allied advance. Drivers worked in 24-hour rotations. One route led east, another west. A one-way system designed to keep traffic flowing like blood through veins. The men behind the wheel were young, most barely 20 years old. Nearly 75% of them were African American soldiers from segregated units, assigned to the Transportation Corps. They were told their job wasn't glamorous, but in truth, their role would prove vital. They drove through rain, mud, and ambush zones, roads clogged with wrecks, bridges bombed out. German snipers still lurked in forests, and yet the convoys rolled, day after day, night after night. Every gallon of gasoline delivered meant another tank reaching the front. Every box of ammunition meant another push east. General George S. Patton himself admitted, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." By September, the Red Ball Express stretched more than 400 miles, from Normandy to the front lines near the German border. It consumed nearly 1 million gallons of fuel a day just to keep moving. But without it, the Allied offensive would have frozen in place. And at the center of it all was that same truck, the humble CCKW, its worthless blueprint now rewritten in diesel and sweat. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was the engine of momentum. Each truck carried the weight of victory itself, not through firepower, but through endurance. By the end of that summer, the Red Ball Express had become the largest and most intense logistical operation in military history. And yet, behind the roar of engines, another story was unfolding, of men, machines, and decisions that turned mechanics into heroes and trucks into legends. As the convoys thundered east toward the German border, the war was changing shape, and so were the people driving it. June 1944, Normandy. The beaches had been won, but the real test had just begun. In the first weeks after D-Day, the Allies pushed inland through hedgerows, rain, and relentless German resistance. Town by town, they clawed their way across northern France. But victory came with a problem no one had predicted in full. Success was moving too fast. Within 30 days of landing, Allied forces had advanced nearly 100 miles from the beaches. Their tanks and vehicles devoured supplies at a rate that shattered every calculation made in London and Washington. Ammunition, rations, and above all, fuel, were running out. Each Sherman tank drank nearly 2 gallons of gasoline for every mile it advanced. The trucks and jeeps that followed them demanded thousands more. The port of Cherbourg had only just been captured, and it was wrecked beyond use. The next major harbor, Antwerp, was still in German hands. The railways were useless. Bombed bridges, twisted rails, and German demolition teams had turned France's transport system into rubble. The Allied war machine was stuck, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower knew what that meant. If the advance stalled, the enemy would regroup, dig in, and turn the summer of victory into another winter of stalemate. Something had to be done. Fast. In late July 1944, at a military logistics meeting in Normandy, a radical plan was proposed: a non-stop truck convoy system, dedicated routes, round-the-clock drivers, no stops except for loading and refueling. The plan's name came from U.S. railroad terminology. Red Ball, the code for express freight lines carrying vital cargo at maximum priority. The system would run from the temporary ports and supply depots near Normandy all the way to the advancing armies, a supply artery, pulsing across hundreds of miles of war-torn France. Every road on that route would be marked with red circles, every vehicle bearing the same symbol on its hood. The Red Ball Express was born, but it needed trucks, thousands of them, and fast. Once again, the Army turned to the one machine that could take the punishment: the GMC CCKW 122-ton truck. Within weeks, more than 6,000 trucks were mobilized. Mechanics stripped, repaired, and refitted every vehicle they could find. The convoys began rolling on August 25, 1944, just as Paris was liberated. The scale was unprecedented. Each day, the Red Ball Express carried more than 12,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food. Enough to sustain the entire Allied advance. Drivers worked in 24-hour rotations. One route led east, another west, a one-way system designed to keep traffic flowing like blood through veins. The men behind the wheel were young, most barely 20 years old. Nearly 75% of them were African American soldiers from segregated units assigned to the Transportation Corps. They were told their job wasn't glamorous, but in truth, their role would prove vital. They drove through rain, mud, and ambush zones, roads clogged with wrecks, bridges bombed out. German snipers still lurked in forests. And yet the convoys rolled, day after day, night after night. Every gallon of gasoline delivered meant another tank reaching the front. Every box of ammunition meant another push east. General George S. Patton himself admitted, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." By September, the Red Ball Express stretched more than 400 miles, from Normandy to the front lines near the German border. It consumed nearly 1 million gallons of fuel a day just to keep moving. But without it, the Allied offensive would have frozen in place, and at the center of it all was that same truck, the humble CCKW, its worthless blueprint now rewritten in diesel and sweat. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was the engine of momentum. Each truck carried the weight of victory itself, not through firepower, but through endurance. By the end of that summer, the Red Ball Express had become the largest and most intense logistical operation in military history. And yet behind the roar of engines, another story was unfolding, of men, machines, and decisions that turned mechanics into heroes and trucks into legends. As the convoys thundered east toward the German border, the war was changing shape, and so were the people driving it. By late August 1944, the roads of France had become rivers of motion. Convoys roared through fields and villages, engines echoing day and night. It was not just machinery at work. It was human endurance stretched to its breaking point. Each driver on the Red Ball Express lived inside a world of endless vibration and fatigue. The men slept in their trucks, ate from ration tins, and drove through darkness so complete that the only light came from the dim glow of blackout lamps and cigarettes. The rules were simple. Don't stop, don't stray, don't slow down. A single stalled truck could block hundreds of vehicles behind it. Each driver carried tools, spare parts, and a jerry can of fuel not just for his cargo, but for himself. If an engine died, he was expected to fix it alone, under fire if necessary. There was no room for hesitation. Every second lost meant fuel tanks running dry at the front. The average Red Ball driver logged more than 16 hours a day behind the wheel. Many went 48 hours without sleep. Some tied a string from their wrist to the steering wheel to keep themselves awake. The twitch of the wheel would jerk them back when their heads began to fall. These men were mostly from the Transportation Corps, a unit rarely celebrated, yet indispensable, and among them, the majority were African American soldiers, serving in segregated units like the 364th and 391st Truck Companies. Denied combat roles, they were assigned to logistics. But the roads they drove were often as deadly as any battlefield. German planes strafed convoys from above. Landmines lined the shoulders of narrow roads. Snipers took shots at headlights. Some trucks never made it through. Yet, the convoys rolled on. Their motto was simple and unspoken. Keep 'em rolling. They raced against hunger, weather, and exhaustion. And won. Every delivery kept Patton's tanks moving, kept Eisenhower's timetable intact, and kept the Allied offensive alive. But the success of the Red Ball Express was not only about human courage, it was also about tactical genius. The system itself was a masterclass in battlefield logistics. Military planners established two main corridors, one eastbound for loaded trucks, one westbound for empties returning to the depots. No civilian traffic was allowed on these routes. Red circles marked every directional signpost, creating an unbroken artery of supply through a devastated country. At its height, the Express operated nearly 6,000 vehicles a day, staffed by more than 23,000 men. Each route was timed to the minute. If a convoy failed to reach its destination, backup units were already dispatched. Fuel dumps and maintenance stations dotted the roadsides like lifelines. Even so, the margin for error was razor-thin. The trucks carried high-octane gasoline. One stray bullet, one careless spark, and an entire convoy could vanish in an instant. The tactical choreography was relentless. Each driver had orders to maintain strict spacing to avoid bottlenecks and collisions. Convoys drove nose to tail through nights of rain, mud, and shell fire. The roads deteriorated under constant use, forcing engineers to rebuild sections in real time. Despite the chaos, the Express worked, because discipline and improvisation became one and the same. Mechanics cannibalized wrecked trucks to repair others. Drivers used sandbags, planks, even clothing to free vehicles from the mud. In some cases, units bypassed destroyed bridges using makeshift river crossings built overnight. The rhythm of war had found a new heartbeat, not in the sound of artillery, but in the grind of gears. Every drum of fuel that reached the front lines translated directly into progress on the battlefield. When Patton's armored columns broke through the Falaise pocket, when the Allies pushed toward the Seine, and when the liberation of Paris became reality, it was the silent, sleepless drivers of the Red Ball Express who made it possible. For them, there were no medals, no parades, only more miles ahead. Yet their story reveals the hidden truth of warfare. Victory depends not only on who fights hardest, but on who moves fastest, and who never stops moving at all. The men behind the wheel understood that. They didn't drive for glory. They drove for survival, for duty, for the soldier on the front line waiting for a jerrycan of gasoline to keep his tank alive another mile. They were the invisible link between the factory and the front, the unbroken chain that turned fuel into freedom. As the convoys thundered through liberated France, another force was working behind the scenes. Engineers, designers, and commanders who turned mechanical simplicity into military perfection. Beneath the mud, rain, and exhaustion of the Red Ball Express lay a story of engineering foresight, of a machine built not for glory, but for endurance. The GMC CCKW 22-ton truck was the workhorse of the Allied advance. To the untrained eye, it looked unremarkable. A steel cab, a wooden cargo bed, 6 wheels, and a simple 6-cylinder engine. But its design was the product of brilliant practicality. Every inch of it was built with one goal: standardization. During World War I, the U.S. Army had used more than 200 different truck models, each with unique parts and maintenance needs. A logistical nightmare. The CCKW changed that forever. It used interchangeable components, a universal chassis, and a drivetrain that could handle mud, snow, and sand alike. Its all-wheel drive allowed it to climb steep hills, ford rivers, and cross the bomb-scarred countryside of France, where railroads had been obliterated. Each truck could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo, or tow a trailer, loaded with another 4,000. The WWII 270 cubic inch engine produced only 91 horsepower, but its reliability was legendary. A single mechanic could strip and rebuild it with nothing more than a wrench, pliers, and grease. The simplicity was its strength. The soldiers called it the Deuce and a half, a nickname that became a badge of respect. It could survive impacts that would destroy a Jeep. It could run on low-octane fuel if necessary. It could even keep rolling with one wheel missing. When the Red Ball Express began, the CCKW became more than transport. It became the nervous system of the Allied Army. Each convoy depended on the same rhythm: load, roll, refuel, return. The trucks were painted olive drab, marked with the red ball insignia, a scarlet circle that became a symbol of speed and dependability. The drivers trusted their machines like lifelines. They knew every sound, every vibration. When a CCKW backfired, the driver could tell if it was fuel mixture, valve timing, or simply exhaustion. Behind this mechanical miracle stood the leaders and planners who turned engineering into operational power. General Brahan B. Somervell, head of the U.S. Army Service Forces, had long argued that logistics, not firepower, would decide the war. His mantra was simple: an army is a team. It lives, eats, and moves as a team. Under his command, the American logistical network became the largest the world had ever seen, a supply chain stretching from Detroit's assembly lines to the hedgerows of Normandy. Working under him was Major General John C. H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone, COMZ. Lee was meticulous and often unpopular, known for demanding discipline in every corner of the supply system. But his obsession with order was exactly what the Red Ball Express needed. He understood that speed without structure was chaos, and that every crate, drum, and bullet had to move like clockwork. Then came the field commanders, Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, men who understood that momentum was life. Patton, especially, pushed logistics to its limit. His tanks could only move as far as the Red Ball could carry them. He once said, half joking and half serious, "My men can't fight if their tanks can't move. And they can't move without gas, and that gas rides in trucks." This chain of vision, from engineer to general, embodied the new face of warfare. For the first time, logistics had become strategy. The men who once drew blueprints in Detroit now indirectly decided the outcomes of battles in Europe. It was a lesson the Allies learned faster than their enemies. While the German army struggled with fuel shortages and fragmented supply lines, the U.S. Army created a mobile logistical network that could rebuild itself in motion. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy system, it was a proof of concept, a demonstration that technology, organization, and human endurance could merge into one unstoppable machine. And the CKW was the perfect vessel for that idea. It wasn't designed for beauty. It was designed for forgiveness. A driver could abuse it, overload it, or repair it with scrap parts, and it would still run. It became the symbol of American production. Rugged, replaceable, relentless. Over 500,000 of them were built during the war, serving in every theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. But nowhere did they earn their legend more completely than in France. The truck's reliability allowed the Red Ball Express to operate at a pace that defied logic, delivering 12,000 tons a day, every day, for nearly 3 months. Without it, the advance across France would have ground to a halt, and behind that success lay the quiet genius of American industry. The factories that built the CCKW worked 24 hours a day. Women and men on the home front assembled engines, cast axles, and packed spare parts. Each piece destined for a road they'd never see, carrying supplies they'd never touch, for soldiers they'd never meet. It was a partnership that spanned oceans, engineers designing for endurance, generals planning for speed, and drivers risking everything to make it real. Together, they turned a blueprint once labeled worthless into the backbone of liberation. But as the Red Ball Express reached its peak in September 1944, the system began to strain under its own weight. Trucks were pushed past their limits. Men were collapsing from exhaustion. And with every mile gained, the supply lines stretched thinner until something had to give. By September 1944, the Red Ball Express was running like a storm with no end. From the beaches of Normandy to the forward depots near the German border, the roads of France thundered with motion. Every dawn, hundreds of convoys roared to life. Engines coughing, gears grinding, drivers blinking away exhaustion as they climbed behind the wheel once again. The numbers were staggering. In just 82 days, more than 412,000 tons of supplies were delivered to the front. The Allied armies were moving faster than any logistical model had predicted. Patton's Third Army alone was consuming 350,000 gallons of gasoline per day, and still demanding more. For the soldiers at the front, this meant momentum. For the men of the Red Ball Express, it meant madness. The trucks rolled day and night, 24 hours straight, along narrow, cratered roads that had never been meant for such traffic. Dust choked the air. Tires burst from overuse. Brakes failed on steep grades. Every hill, every turn, every patch of mud was another gamble. Some convoys stretched for 50 miles, a steel serpent winding through France. If one truck stalled, the entire line backed up for miles. So drivers improvised. They learned to fix engines on the move, to patch holes with rope and tape, to pour water over brakes that smoked red-hot from mountain descents. They had no headlights, no radios, no air support. Their only guide was instinct, and the dim red circle painted on roadside signs, marking the lifeline they followed blindly into the dark. Enemy threats were never far away. Though the German army was retreating, pockets of resistance remained. Snipers harassed convoys from the woods. Luftwaffe planes, few but still dangerous, strafed the roads by day. In some regions, saboteurs mined bridges or hijacked trucks carrying gasoline. The drivers adapted fast. Some convoys mounted machine guns on their trucks. Others traveled in groups, trading shifts only when the road allowed a brief stop. If a driver fell asleep, his buddy would slap him awake. If a truck crashed, the next in line would pull the load off and keep going. The rule was simple. Nothing stops the express. By early September, the pressure was reaching critical levels. The Allies had liberated Paris, pushed through the Seine, and were closing on the German frontier. But their speed was now their enemy. Every mile forward stretched the supply lines another mile thinner. Fuel depots ran dry faster than they could be refilled. Maintenance crews were overwhelmed. In the rear, at depots near Saint-Lô and Chartres, the workload was endless. Mechanics rebuilt transmissions in open fields. Tires were patched with scrap rubber. Trucks that had already logged 10,000 miles since D-Day were being pushed to drive another 1,000. The men themselves were running on fumes. The 391st Truck Company reported drivers averaging only 3 hours of sleep per night. Some soldiers collapsed from exhaustion mid-route. Others drifted into ditches, waking only to the impact. In one grim statistic, more men were injured in accidents on the Red Ball roads than in combat zones nearby. Still, morale held, a mixture of pride and defiance. The drivers knew what was at stake. They heard the news from the front lines. The liberation of Paris, the drive toward Belgium, the crumbling of German resistance. Each load they carried meant progress. Each successful run meant lives saved. One logistics officer described it simply. We were moving faster than war was supposed to allow. But there were limits, even to miracles. By mid-September, heavy rains turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Trucks sank to their axles. Engines flooded. The convoys slowed, snarled, and in some sectors stopped altogether. The demand for gasoline was doubling every week, and even the mighty CCKW couldn't outpace nature. Meanwhile, the port situation remained dire. Antwerp was still not open. Cherbourg's facilities were stretched to breaking. The trucks were now hauling supplies nearly 500 miles from the E. Normandy coast to the front, a distance that consumed almost as much fuel as it delivered. Commanders began to realize the Red Ball Express had reached its breaking point. The system that had carried the Allied armies through France was straining under its own success. Trucks wore out faster than replacements could arrive. Spare parts were vanishing. Drivers were reaching their human limits. And yet, they refused to stop. In September 1944, as the clouds of autumn gathered, the Red Ball Express reached its peak. Nearly 132,000 gallons of fuel delivered daily to the front lines. Those convoys, invisible to the headlines, were the pulse of victory. Every time an American tank fired, every time a division advanced another mile, it was because somewhere down the line, a sleepless driver kept his foot on the accelerator. The miracle of motion had turned into a crucible of endurance, and soon it would all begin to collapse under the sheer weight of success. As the rains deepened and the front lines stretched to the German border, the Red Ball Express faced its greatest test yet, a test of survival itself. By late September 1944, the miracle had turned into a nightmare. What had begun as the greatest supply operation of the war was now collapsing under its own weight. The Red Ball Express had done the impossible, but it had done it too well. The Allied advance was racing far beyond the original supply plan. Tanks and infantry were sprinting toward the German frontier, but the trucks that fed them were still trapped on the torn, narrow arteries of northern France. Every extra mile meant more strain. Engines burned out, tires shredded. Axles snapped like matchsticks. Mechanics were out of parts, out of tools, out of sleep. At the same time, the men behind the wheel were breaking too. Most of the drivers had been working non-stop for more than 2 months, 3, sometimes 4 convoys per day. 10, 12, 16 hours straight. Through rain, mud, and darkness. The trucks had no heaters, no radios, no comfort of any kind. The sound of the engine became a kind of madness, constant, vibrating, endless. Some drivers began hallucinating on the road, seeing shapes in the fog that weren't there. Others dozed mid-drive, their trucks veering into ditches or colliding with convoys ahead. There was no room for error, but no energy left to avoid it. The routes were choking under congestion. At times, as many as 5,000 trucks were operating on a single stretch of road. Dust turned the air opaque. The roar was deafening. And when rain fell, the same roads that once shimmered with sunlight turned into trenches of mud. Convoys moved at walking speed. When one truck stalled, others had to tow it out before the entire line froze. Some drivers spent 12 hours covering just 40 miles, and yet they couldn't stop. The orders were clear: keep the supplies moving. Commanders grew desperate. Patton's tanks were running dry. Front-line troops rationed gasoline, holding position not because of the enemy, but because the trucks behind them couldn't keep up. Fuel depots began running dangerously low. What had once been a river of supplies became a trickle. In the midst of this chaos, ingenuity became the only weapon left. Mechanics cannibalized broken trucks for parts. Tires were patched from the rubber of destroyed vehicles. Some units, even, used captured German trucks, painted over with Allied markings, to keep convoys alive. But even with all this improvisation, the truth was clear. The Red Ball Express could not sustain itself much longer. The weather worsened. The nights grew colder. The men grew slower. And still, the front lines demanded more. By October, the convoys were burning through almost as much fuel as they delivered. The 2 1-2-ton CCKWs, those same trucks once rejected as too light and too weak, were carrying loads triple their design weight. Their suspensions sagged. Their engines screamed. Some trucks made it only halfway before dying in the mud, abandoned and stripped bare for parts. Even morale, that last invisible fuel, was slipping away. For many of the African American drivers who made up nearly 75% of the Red Ball Express, the mission was more than duty. It was a chance to prove themselves in a segregated army that doubted their worth. but the endless fatigue and danger took their toll. Letters home spoke of exhaustion deeper than pain, of men who drove through rain so thick they couldn't see their own hood, of comrades lost to accidents that no one ever reported. Yet they carried on, because somewhere beyond the horizon, other soldiers, white, black, every kind, were counting on them to fight another day. By mid-October, Allied command finally began to face reality. The Red Ball Express had reached its limit. A new network of supply routes was ordered. The White Ball, Green Diamond, and XYZ Expresses, each one designed to take pressure off the main arteries. At the same time, port operations at Cherbourg and Le Havre expanded, and railroads began to function again. Slowly, painfully, the impossible load was being redistributed. And with that, the original Red Ball Express, the legend, began to fade. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially shut down. Its mission complete. Its trucks worn to the bone. Its drivers, ghosts of men, finally allowed to rest. They had carried over 412,000 tons of supplies, gasoline, rations, ammunition. Across more than 11 million miles of war-torn roads, they had done what no one thought possible. As one officer later wrote, without the Red Ball Express, there would have been no pursuit across France, no liberation of Paris, no drive to the Rhine. It wasn't glory that drove them. It was necessity. It wasn't victory that defined them. It was endurance. When the convoys finally stopped, silence fell over the French countryside. The same roads that had once pulsed like arteries now lay still, scarred by tire tracks and littered with wrecked engines. But history remembers. And in the echo of those tires, in the ghostly hum of engines that refused to quit, lives the story of the men who powered victory not with bullets or medals, but with grit, sweat, and a steering wheel. The Red Ball Express had burned itself to ashes, but in doing so, it carried a continent toward freedom. When the Red Ball Express officially halted operations on November 16, 1944, there was no parade, no speeches, no ceremony. The convoys simply stopped rolling. Engines were shut off for the first time in months, and the sound that replaced them, silence, was almost unbearable. Trucks that had once raced across France now sat abandoned in the fields near Chartres and Alençon. Some were stripped for parts, others repurposed for local transport. The black and white signs marked Red Ball Route were taken down one by one. But the men who had kept that lifeline alive carried memories that no report could capture. They remembered sleeping under their trucks because there were no tents. They remembered pushing stuck vehicles through mud waist deep. They remembered convoys burning in the night after Luftwaffe raids. Though rare, every loss felt personal. And most of all, they remembered the faces of comrades who didn't come back. According to Army records, more than 300 men were killed or injured during Red Ball operations. Not from combat, but from exhaustion, collisions, and mechanical failure. Their deaths never made headlines, but without them, victory would have stalled somewhere in the French countryside. When General Eisenhower reviewed the logistical data later, he understood what those men had accomplished. He called the Red Ball Express the miracle that made victory in Europe possible. Behind the headline numbers, 412,000 tons of supplies delivered, 11 million miles driven, lay an untold truth. Logistics had won the war as surely as bullets had. For the soldiers on the front, the trucks meant survival. Fuel for Patton's tanks, food for infantry trapped in rain-soaked foxholes, ammunition for artillery pounding German positions day after day. Every shell fired in the push toward the Rhine had once rattled in the back of a CCKW truck. Every meal eaten on the front lines came from the same lifeline that began on the Normandy beaches. But the Red Ball Express left behind more than just numbers. It left behind a transformation in military thinking and in the men themselves. For the African American drivers who formed nearly 3/4 of its ranks, the operation was both a burden and a breakthrough. They had worked in a segregated army that often doubted their discipline and skill. But when Europe needed fuel and ammunition, it was their hands that delivered it. Many officers later admitted that without those black drivers, the Red Ball Express would have collapsed within weeks. The system had depended entirely on their endurance. One driver, Private Willie Watkins, summed it up years later. "We didn't think about race when we were on that road. You drove your truck, you kept it running, and you prayed you'd make it to the next depot. That's all that mattered." In the quiet months after the convoys ended, many of these men were reassigned, some to rail units, others to new supply routes deeper into Germany. But history, for a time, forgot them. The headlines went to the generals and the battles. The medals went to those at the front. Yet in every strategic report written after 1945, one line reappeared again and again. The lessons of the Red Ball Express must never be forgotten. Because what it proved went beyond heroism. It proved that mobility is power, that a tank without fuel is useless. That victory belongs not just to those who fight, but to those who keep the fighters moving. And from that understanding came an entirely new way of thinking about warfare. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps, born from the ashes of the Express, became the model for every modern military supply chain. The lessons of the Red Ball, centralized command, continuous flow, redundancy, adaptability, shaped logistics in Korea, Vietnam, and even into the 21st century. The truck that once seemed worthless had reshaped the science of war. The convoys may have vanished from the French roads, but the echo of their engines carried into every battlefield that came after. In the decades that followed, the legend of the Red Ball Express faded quietly into the background of World War II history. For years, its story lived mostly in dusty archives and logistics reports, overshadowed by tales of tank battles, air raids, and generals. But for those who had driven those trucks, the memories never left. They could still hear the constant hum of engines at night, the clatter of wheels on broken French roads, the flicker of convoy lamps snaking through fog. When historians finally revisited the operation in the 1960s, they were astonished at its scale, and even more at its improvisation. The Red Ball Express had been built in a matter of days. No precedent, no blueprint, no guarantee of success. Yet it worked. Military scholars began calling it a logistical masterpiece. Others described it as the backbone of Allied momentum. The truth was more human. It wasn't just planning or machinery that made it succeed. It was the people who refused to quit. The truckers, most of them barely trained soldiers, learned to fix engines by feel, navigate by moonlight, and sleep in stolen moments between loads. Mechanics turned wreckage into spare parts. Dispatchers memorized the locations of convoys. Like chess pieces across a battlefield, they had built an empire of motion out of chaos, and their legacy would ripple far beyond the war. When the U.S. military reorganized its global logistics in the 1950s, the Red Ball model became the foundation. The first time supply as strategy was treated as seriously as firepower. Every modern supply chain, from armored divisions to humanitarian relief efforts, carries a piece of that DNA. Even the name Red Ball Express became shorthand in military culture for keep it moving no matter what. But there was another legacy. Quieter, deeper, more human. For thousands of African American soldiers who had driven those convoys, The Red Ball Express became a symbol of unrecognized service. In an era when segregation still divided mess halls and barracks, they had proved that courage and competence knew no color. When the U.S. Armed Forces began desegregation in 1948, President Truman's Executive Order 9981 cited the demonstrated performance of colored troops during the recent war, and among the examples reviewed by policymakers was the record of the Red Ball Express. It wasn't a medal, but it was vindication. The road to equality, like those muddy French routes, had been long and brutal, but every mile driven had mattered. In 1992, the U.S. Army finally dedicated a permanent memorial at Fort Eustis, Virginia, the home of the Transportation Corps. The plaque reads, "They delivered the supplies that delivered victory." And across France, in places where tire ruts once carved the soil, small roadside markers still stand, simple black circles painted with red dots, silent tributes to the convoys that never stopped rolling. Today, when modern armies deploy convoys in distant wars, in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Eastern Europe, their supply trucks bear the same spirit, the same urgency, the same code: keep the lifeline open, whatever the cost. That spirit, born from a worthless truck blueprint, became one of the most enduring lessons of World War II. It taught the world that logistics wins wars before battles ever begin. It taught commanders that victory depends not only on courage, but on coordination. And it taught soldiers that history remembers those who endure, even when no one is watching. By the time the last surviving veterans of the Red Ball Express were interviewed in the 21st century, most were in their 80s or 90s. Yet when asked what kept them going through those endless nights, they all said the same thing: somebody out there needed what we were carrying. That was the heart of it. Not glory, not fame, just purpose. And purpose, once set in motion, never stops moving. History often remembers the noise, the battles, the speeches, the victories. But the story of the Red Ball Express lives in the silence that followed, in the stillness of a French road at dawn, where a single tire track cuts through the mud, in the quiet pride of a driver who never fired a weapon, yet helped win a war. The Red Ball Express was never about glory. It was about motion, about what happens when ordinary people keep moving in extraordinary times. It began with a rejected blueprint, a design dismissed as too weak, too simple, too small. But in that simplicity lay genius. The 212-ton CCKW truck, once labeled worthless, became the heartbeat of freedom, carrying the weight of armies, dreams, and hope itself. In those convoys rolled the essence of human endurance. Men driving through exhaustion, rain, and fear, not because they were told to, but because they refused to stop. They built no monuments, they fought no famous battles, yet their work echoed louder than any artillery, because it sustained everything else. Every modern engine, every highway of steel and logistics that powers nations today, traces its lineage back to those dirt roads in France. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply an army, it supplied belief. Belief that even in chaos, discipline can prevail. That unity can overcome prejudice. That the smallest wheel, if it keeps turning, can move the world. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of the Red Ball Express. That history isn't made only by those who lead or fight, but by those who carry the load, mile after mile, unseen and uncelebrated, until victory finally arrives. In the end, when the engine stopped and the world exhaled, the road they left behind became more than a route. It became a symbol, a reminder that even from what the world calls worthless, greatness can begin to move.